The Roaring Twenties are going to come to an end in 1929 when they're replaced with the Great Depression. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the causes of that Great Depression, and looking backwards, it's not that hard to see the signs as they began to take shape in the 1920s, although people then didn't pay attention. For starters, prosperity in this country was unevenly distributed. You can see from the statistics here that the wealthiest 1% of Americans owned a third of all assets, whereas 60% of Americans had incomes below the poverty line. When we think of the Roaring Twenties, we really need to limit those good times to city dwellers, because rural folks were not experiencing the roaring good times of the 1920s. All right, farmers were hurting through the 1920s. Another reason was overproduction. We see here on the chart that farms and factories overproduced beyond the demand. We were just talking about farms a second ago, and farmers had mortgaged their farms to purchase equipment with the purpose of boosting production, increasing their harvests, and they did. Unfortunately, when demand dropped after World War I, they were producing a lot of food. Americans weren't demanding as much food, so prices dropped significantly. Farmers were not making a lot of money. In the case of factories, we've talked about the fact that they were producing consumer goods, but as we move further into the 1920s, how many refrigerators or irons or washing machines or vacuum cleaners or even radios does one household need to buy? So we can see here, looking at the cycle, businesses are going to begin cutting production, which means that, looking over to the right, that they're going to lay off workers. And that means you have a group of people that have no money to spend, which is going to further depress demand for goods, which is going to lead businesses to cut further, and we end up with this vicious cycle. We looked in an earlier lesson in this unit that Americans were buying all of these wonderful new products on credit. All right, so they didn't have the money to pay for the things that they wanted to purchase, so they financed them. They bought them on credit. We called that at the time installment buying. Either way, if they're going to lose their job, and many Americans did in 1929, they're no longer going to be able to make these payments. So buying on credit caused a large increase in personal debt, which is going to be a major reason for the Depression. Let's continue our credit argument, because many people began to buy stock because the stock market trended through the 1920s mostly up. But you could buy stock on margin, which means you could put down 10% and borrow 90% of what you wanted. So if you put down $100, you could buy $1,000 worth of stock, borrowing the other $900. You can see from the chart here, let's see if I can make it a little bit larger, that this is fine as long as the market keeps going up. Everybody's going to be happy. But on Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, the market is going to begin to crater, as we see here. We'll talk about that in a moment. That's going to lead to margin calls, and the brokerage houses are going to want the money, which is going to lead people to sell their stock and perhaps be unable to make those payments, leading to further difficulties, particularly in the market. As I said a second ago, October 29th was known as Black Tuesday. 16.4 million shares of stock sell-off as investors raced to get out of the market. You can see here this says Black Thursday in America, which was earlier, slightly earlier, but and the market took several dives in late October, but the biggest of which was Tuesday the 29th. So what are people to do? They're losing their job. If they put money in the market, it was gone. They went to the bank. Good thing they had kept some in the savings account. Unfortunately, the banks took depositors' savings and put them in the market as well. So the banks lost money. This is going to lead to bank failures and bank closures. Through the early 1930s, there were over 5,500 bank failures. Banks that simply closed their doors, leaving depositors with no money. This chart shows the stock market, and you can see from the 1929 crash there's a slight rebound beginning to look positive, but as people can't repay their loans, banks don't have money to loan individuals or businesses, and what we see here is a continual slide in the stock market, meaning the prices of stocks are going to continue to drop. You're looking at the Dow Jones average, which drops, I can make this a little bit larger, drops in 1932, July of 1932, to as low as 41. But at the initial height of the 1929, prior to the crash, that number, the Dow, was as high as 388. So it dropped, basically the stock market dropped essentially 90% in value. Many companies' stock prices went to zero and the companies went out of business. Right? A lot of other companies dropped significantly in value. Now, I should point out that the stock market crash was not a cause of the Great Depression. It simply announced its arrival. The overproduction, the failure of the banks, buying on credit, including buying stock on margin, were all causes of the Depression itself. But here we're looking at a period of severe economic decline. You can see the dates from 1929 until 1941. And the unemployment rate reached as high as 25%, meaning 1 out of every 4 workers was looking for work and couldn't find a job. Americans lined up for food. Note the irony in the photo on the right. The people lined up for food and what the poster says behind them. Fathers and sons got out of the house. It was one less mouth to feed. They rode the rails, boxcars to other cities looking for work. Women actually had a slightly easier time of things during the Great Depression. They were able to work as domestic servants and whatnot. So it was the men that had greater unemployment. I haven't mentioned yet that Herbert Hoover ran for election after Calvin Coolidge in 1928, and Americans continued the Republican domination of the presidency by putting Hoover in office. Hoover's lack of action is going to anger a lot of people during the Depression. In this particular instance, what we're looking at here with the bonus army, his actions are going to anger a lot of Americans. These were World War I veterans who were told that they would receive a bonus payment in the 1930s, and now they were in Washington, D.C., camping out, as you can see from the photos, asking Congress to be paid earlier, and Congress declined to accelerate that payment. Given the fact that these folks were unemployed and had nowhere to go, this turned into a massive campout, and President Hoover ordered the Army to move these veterans out of their campsites. He ordered the campsites cleared out. You can see the gas mask that the soldier is wearing. They used tear gas and whatnot to chase these veterans out. When newspapers picked this story up, a lot of people were very upset at the president for ordering this to take place. As people lost their homes because they couldn't pay the bank, their mortgage, or they lost it due to rent, shanty towns developed in cities across the country, Seattle on the top. On the right, we've got New York City and Central Park. Altogether, these were known as Hoovervilles, and this was a slap in the face to President Hoover, who, again, Americans viewed as not acting enough, not doing enough to ease their pain. Hoover blanket, I know this is a painting, but You've got a homeless person using newspaper to cover themselves. Again, meant as a slap at the president. You can see here from this political cartoon, Americans blamed Hoover largely for his inaction in helping them and ease their suffering. We've talked about farmers having difficulty. Midwestern farmers had things particularly difficult in the 1930s with the onset of what was known as the Dust Bowl. This map shows right down the spine of the central part of the United States a period of severe drought over several years, which literally turned, let me just go back here, turned things to dust, and nothing was really able to grow. You can see it almost looks like a desert wasteland in these photos, what was farmland in that area. This photo of the woman and her 2 children is actually a very famous Depression-era photo taken by Dorothea Lange. You can see a cloud of dust, a dust storm moving in the top photo. Let's move on. Dust Bowl refugees. People had to leave. Again, the banks foreclosed on the farms, and the farmers in those areas left. They packed up what you see here and in their cars and made their way out to California. John Steinbeck's book, The Grapes of Wrath, while fiction, a fictionalized account, details the plight of the Midwestern farmers that made that trip to California and became migrant farm workers. So then, taking a look at the end here, just to sum up, you can see the top left, we've got the economic causes of the Great Depression, buying stocks on margin, the widening gap between the rich and the poor, agricultural overproduction, as well as factory overproduction. Right, we've got political causes that exacerbated the Depression, Hoover's hands-off policy towards business, and really hands-off in trying to assist people. It's not that he didn't do anything to assist folks. He was looking for business, voluntary compliance from business. You can see very few regulations in place. The economic effects, we've got deflation, which we did not talk about in this lesson. We've got about 25% unemployment rate in 1932. Drop in production. We have not talked about Hitler taking power in Germany. We will in later lessons starting in the next unit. But what we will talk about in the next lesson, Hoover is going to be bounced out of the presidency, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to be elected in a landslide election in 1932. And we'll talk about the things that he put in place to ease American suffering.